Human history knows countless wars. It knows the fall of states, the rise and fall of dynasties, epidemics, and disasters. But in most cases, these events were local. One empire would collapse here, another would emerge there, and the world continued. Yet sometimes history reaches a moment when it is not a single country that breaks, but the entire system all at once. Around 1177 BC, humanity experienced exactly such a moment. Within a single generation, empires that had existed for centuries vanished. Trade routes connecting Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean world collapsed. Cities that had once been prosperous and populous were burned or abandoned. Writing systems used for centuries were forgotten. Standards of living fell sharply, and in some regions, civilization receded by hundreds of years. Contemporaries did not understand what was happening. To them, it appeared as a series of disasters: famine, wars, raids, and mass migrations. But today, archaeology and ancient texts reveal this was a single, interconnected crisis that engulfed the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. At the center of this collapse, ancient sources repeatedly mention a mysterious force. Egyptian texts call them people who came from the sea. They speak of entire peoples moving along the coasts, destroying cities, and seeking new lands to settle. Later historians would give them a collective name, the Sea Peoples. Who were they really? Ruthless conquerors? Desperate refugees? Or merely the visible face of a much deeper crisis? And most importantly, did the Sea Peoples truly destroy the Bronze Age world? Or were they only the final blow to a system that was already doomed? To answer these questions, we must return to the world that existed before the catastrophe. By the 13th century BC, the Bronze Age world still appears stable. Empires stand, trade continues, armies march on campaigns. But beneath the surface, the first warning signs are already emerging. One of them is the climate. Research shows that across the Eastern Mediterranean, conditions were gradually becoming drier. Rainfall decreased, periods of drought grew longer, and harvests became increasingly unpredictable. For societies directly dependent on agriculture, this meant a constant risk of famine. In royal letters, requests for grain begin to appear. Rulers asked neighbors for assistance, exchanged reserves, and tried to fill shortages. Through diplomacy, this was the first warning sign. The system could no longer sustain itself. The second blow came from nature. The Aegean region lies in a seismically active zone. At the end of the Bronze Age, a series of earthquakes destroyed cities and ports. Palaces, granaries, and harbors all required immediate repair. But reconstruction demanded resources, labor, and a stable economy. Stability was already gone. Trade, which held this interconnected world together, began to falter. Ships arrived less frequently. Some routes were completely cut off. Ports that had once been bustling gradually emptied. Without trade, the Bronze Age world could not function. Copper and tin came from different regions. If even a single link in this chain broke, bronze production declined, and with it, armies weakened, states lost power. Empires tried to respond, but their reactions often made matters worse. To compensate for losses, taxes were raised. People were required to provide more grain, more labor, more loyalty. To maintain order, armies were strengthened. More resources were poured into soldiers' upkeep. Control tightened. Administrations increased pressure on cities and communities. But instead of stability, this created tension. People fled. Regions emptied. Local conflicts erupted. With growing frequency, empires designed to manage a complex world became prisoners of their own complexity. Each attempt to hold the system together only made it more overloaded. By the 13th century BC, The Bronze Age world was no longer standing on solid ground. It was teetering, and all it needed was one strong push to begin collapsing. When we talk about the Sea Peoples, it is important to make one clarification right away. This is not the name of a single people, nor the name of one tribe. Egyptian sources, which first mention these groups, do not describe a unified nation. Instead, they list separate groups, each with its own name. In texts and reliefs, we find names such as Shurden, Shikalesh, Peleset, Denyen, Jeker, and several others. This is an important signal. Before us is not the army of one king, nor an organized state. It is a movement of peoples, bound not by politics, but by a shared fate. To the Egyptians, all of them appeared equally dangerous. They came from the sea, moved along the coasts, and brought destruction with them. But looking closer, it becomes clear, these were not just warriors. On the reliefs of Ramesses III's temple, at Medinet Habu, we see an unusual scene. Alongside armed men, there are women and children, carts loaded with belongings, domestic animals. For a military raid, this would seem strange. But for migration, it makes perfect sense. This was not a raid for plunder. It was the movement of entire communities, seeking new lands to settle. Why did they move? There is no exact answer, but most historians agree on one point. These people themselves had become victims of an earlier crisis. The Aegean world and Anatolia were already suffering from droughts, failed harvests, earthquakes, and the collapse of previous social and political order. When cities fall, trade routes vanish, and there is nothing left to eat, people start moving, at first in small groups, then whole tribes, and eventually in waves. Each new wave collided with regions that were already weakened. In this way, refugees became conquerors. It is important to understand, the Sea Peoples did not plan to destroy civilizations. They had no overall strategy and no unified command. But as they moved along the chain, from one coast to another, they shattered the fragile balance that the Bronze Age world depended upon. In some places, they burned cities. In others, they seized ports. Elsewhere, they simply displaced local populations. And each such blow triggered a new crisis down the chain. This is why the Sea Peoples were not merely participants in the catastrophe, but its catalyst. They did not create chaos, but they made it irreversible. One of the first victims of the Bronze Age catastrophe was the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were a superpower of their time. They controlled much of Anatolia, had an advanced administrative system, a powerful army and skilled diplomacy, and they knew how to wage wars and form alliances. The Hittite Empire constantly competed with Egypt for control over Syria. Although peace treaties were occasionally signed, rivalry remained a constant feature of the region. Economically, the Hittites were also strong. They controlled trade routes, through which copper, tin, bronze, and grain flowed. This network ensured the prosperity of cities, palaces, and armies. But it was precisely at these trade hubs that they became vulnerable to external shocks. By the 13th century BC, the Hittite Empire was already experiencing difficulties. Populations suffered from droughts and poor harvests, and some provinces lost stability. Palace storerooms were either overflowing or emptied, and the economic system began to falter. At this very moment, the Sea Peoples began to appear. These migrating groups, moving along the coasts, put pressure on the Hittite shores and ports. They invaded enclaves, burned cities, disrupted trade routes, and destabilized provinces. The consequences for the Hittite Empire were catastrophic. The capital, Hattusa, was burned, archives abruptly end, and the king vanishes from history. This was not a slow decline. It was a sudden collapse, the result of multiple interacting factors: internal economic instability, natural disasters, social unrest, and pressure from external migrating peoples. The ruins of cities today reveal the scale of destruction. Palaces, temples, fortifications, all disappeared in nearly a single generation. Local populations either perished or fled to neighboring regions. This power, which had for centuries been one of the dominant forces in the Eastern Mediterranean, simply vanished. Interestingly, the consequences of this collapse were not limited to Anatolia alone. With the disruption of the Hittite trade network, neighboring states also suffered. The Aegean world and Mycenae lost their connections, accelerating their own decline. Ports emptied, markets were devastated, and the chain reaction of crisis spread throughout the region. Thus, the Hittite Empire became a vivid example of how a strong, seemingly eternal empire can disappear almost within a single generation, when internal and external factors combine into a powerful chain of destruction. After the destruction of the Hittite Empire, the Bronze Age catastrophe spread to the Aegean region. The Mycenaean civilization, one of the most advanced of its time, consisted of a network of palace centers: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and others. These palaces were centers of power, economic control, and military administration. Through them, grain, bronze, copper, and tin were distributed. They collected taxes, oversaw craft workshops, and managed a complex bureaucracy. To contemporaries, these palaces symbolized order and prosperity. But by the 13th century BC, the system had begun to crack. Droughts, poor harvests, and internal unrest weakened the palace states. Trade routes connecting the Mycenaeans with Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean were disrupted under the pressure of the Sea Peoples' migrations. These external shocks triggered a chain reaction. The Sea Peoples raided coastal areas, destroyed cities, plundered storerooms, and burned settlements. Palaces, where previously accounting and economic management were conducted, became vulnerable and poorly defended. Mycenaean cities began to fall one by one. Local populations perished, fled, or lost their means of subsistence. With the palace system gone, centralized administration vanished. With the disappearance of linear writing, the very concept of the state disappeared. Without records of taxes, food distribution, and armies, governance became impossible. Gradually, the Dark Age of Greece began. This was not simply a matter of no palaces. It was a profound cultural and social decline. Craftsmanship diminished, complex technologies disappeared, contact with the outside world dwindled, and writing was almost entirely forgotten for nearly 4 centuries. Populations faced a survival crisis. Small communities were forced to live locally, without a centralized economy. This era became one of population reduction and simplified social structures. What had once seemed stable proved to be fragile. Thus, the fall of Mycenae was not random destruction. It was the inevitable result of the combination of internal problems and external pressure. The Mycenaean civilization vanished, leaving behind only ruins and legends that would later form the foundation of Greek myths. And in place of mighty palaces arose a world of new, simpler societies. A world where civilization was no longer capable of the organizational scale that had existed during the Bronze Age. By the 13th century BC, Egypt remained the last major center of power. In the Eastern Mediterranean, pharaohs ruled from Memphis and Thebes, maintaining stability across the country, from the Nile Delta to the borders of Nubia. The Egyptian economy, based on agriculture and trade, was still functioning but began to show alarming signs of instability. Poor harvests, droughts in certain regions, and rising grain prices. At this time, Ramesses III received troubling reports from distant provinces. Cities across the Eastern Mediterranean were falling one by one, peoples were moving along the coasts, and fleets, once considered untouchable, were advancing toward Egypt's borders. He understood. This was no ordinary enemy. No single army had come alone. These were entire peoples moving with families, livestock, and carts. They were not merely invading. They were shifting the balance of power in the region. Ramesses III began mobilization. The army was reinforced. Each port and harbor was put on defensive alert, soldiers trained, and coastal fortresses strengthened. But the threat was not only external. Tensions inside the country were rising. Crisis years led to higher taxes, royal grain reserves were stretched, and pockets of discontent began to emerge among the population. The pharaoh understood that any mistake could be catastrophic. Politically, Egypt faced a dilemma. Should it fight for every coastal colony, or focus on defending the central lands? The choice was difficult. Allowing the invaders to pass in the north meant losing control over trade routes, but an audacious offensive could further weaken an already overburdened army. Ramesses III decided to act decisively. He built defensive fortifications, mobilized the fleet, and prepared troops for a maritime operation. The objective was clear: to stop the Sea Peoples before they reached the Nile Delta. These events demonstrate that Egypt, at the end of the Bronze Age, was the last great power, still capable of resisting the destructive force of migrating peoples. Yet even for Egypt, the threat was serious. For the first time in centuries, the country faced an enemy that could not be defeated by traditional means alone. Ramesses III understood: to wait for a siege was to lose. Egypt could not afford to lose control of the Nile Delta, the main source of food and a strategically vital region. The pharaoh carefully studied the terrain. The Nile Delta is a labyrinth of rivers, channels, and islands. For an experienced navy, it was a natural trap. Ramesses ordered the riverbanks fortified, ambushes set, and archers positioned at key points. The fleet of the Sea Peoples advanced along the coast, carrying troops, families, livestock, and belongings on their ships. Each vessel was heavily loaded, limiting maneuverability. As they entered the Nile's estuary, the Egyptian army launched its operation. Archers on the shores and fortifications rained volleys of arrows, tearing sails and knocking soldiers into the water. Egyptian forces employed tactical maneuvers. Narrow channels hindered the enemy's movement. Heavily laden ships collided with each other, and Egyptian boats fired from the flanks. On some ships, fires broke out. Soldiers of the Sea Peoples drowned, their heavy armor preventing them from escaping. Some captives were taken, others perished. Families and possessions of the invaders were lost, completely disrupting their invasion plan. This battle became the first documented naval battle in human history. Its significance lies not only in the weapons or numbers involved, but in how the Egyptians were able to use geography and strategy to secure victory. After the triumph, Ramesses III reinforced the delta, organized control over coasts and ports, ensuring that further invasions would be impossible. The pharaoh demonstrated his authority, restored trade, and strengthened diplomatic ties to compensate for the losses caused by the crisis. This victory was important not only for Egypt, but for the entire Eastern Mediterranean. It halted the mass invasion of the Sea Peoples, gave regional states a chance to stabilize, and allowed Egypt to maintain its central role in geopolitics. Although Ramesses III won the great naval battle, this did not restore peace to the Eastern Mediterranean. The chain reaction of the crisis, triggered by droughts, earthquakes, and the migrations of the Sea Peoples, had already destroyed the trade networks connecting Egypt, Mycenae, the Hittite Empire, and Cyprus. Major ports and trade routes lay in ruins. Copper, tin, and bronze, the resources on which armies and crafts depended, no longer flowed in sufficient quantities. Empires that had maintained order for centuries either disappeared or weakened into local communities. The Hittite Empire was destroyed. Mycenaean Greece entered the Dark Ages. Other civilizations that had once thrived lost writing systems and complex technologies. Even Egypt, which managed to hold its borders and stop the invasion, never returned to its former level of power. Financial reserves were depleted, the army overstretched, and trade was only partially restored. New stability arrived slowly and remained fragile. Culture and social structures changed forever. Craftsmanship simplified, writing declined in use, and centralized bureaucracy weakened. Society adapted to a new world. Smaller settlements, simpler economies, and local connections replacing interregional trade networks. Thus, Ramesses III's victory was a strategic achievement, but it did not stop the catastrophe. The Bronze Age world had collapsed. In place of the prosperous empires arose a new era, a world where previous structures of power and wealth were no longer possible. 1177 BC remains a symbol of a turning point. It was a year when civilizations did not fall due to a single enemy, but because of the combination of crises, migratory pressures, and the inherent fragility of systems. Victory was achieved, but salvation was not. In this way, Ramesses III's strategy serves as an example of how skillful use of geography, careful preparation, and army discipline can influence the course of events, even against a numerically superior opponent. For a long time, the Sea Peoples were considered the main cause of the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations. But modern research shows they were merely the final push that toppled a system already on the brink. By the 13th century BC, the world had become too complex, too dependent on trade and supply networks, and too vulnerable to natural and social catastrophes. A small disruption in food supplies, or a local migration could trigger a chain reaction, destroying empires, trade routes, and cultural centers. When bronze disappeared and the flow of copper and tin ceased, armies and palaces collapsed. When armies and authority vanished, states fell. The Hittite Empire disappeared. Mycenae plunged into the Dark Ages. Cities across the eastern Mediterranean turned to ruins. Even Egypt, which defeated the Sea Peoples, remained weakened and vulnerable. 1177 BC is not just a date. It is a symbol of the fragility of civilizations, a reminder that even the most complex systems can collapse under their own weight. The history of the Bronze Age teaches us to understand the mechanisms of collapse. Civilizations do not fall because of a single enemy. They fall when internal problems, external threats, and random events combine to create a chain that can no longer be stopped. This lesson remains relevant thousands of years later. Modern societies, dependent on complex networks of trade, communication, and technology, are also vulnerable to crises that can begin in one corner of the world and rapidly spread throughout the system. 1177 BC is a warning that humanity hears again and again. Complexity creates opportunity, but it also creates vulnerability. Powerful states can disappear, civilizations can collapse within a single generation, and the consequences are felt for centuries. Victory or defeat, wars or migrations, all are just parts of the bigger picture. The main lesson is clear: history is cyclical, and the lessons of the past remain relevant. Any system, whether the Bronze Age world or modern society, must be flexible to survive unforeseen catastrophes.